Let's be honest, Eleanor said, her voice slicing through the chatter like a blade wrapped in silk. Blood builds legacies. Outsiders only borrow them. The laughter died in midair. The chandelier hummed faintly, filling the silence she left behind. I felt every eye shift, not toward me, but around me, like a secret everyone wanted to acknowledge without being the first to speak it. Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that asked for agreement, not conversation. It's nothing personal, she added, tilting her glass just enough for the light to catch her diamond ring. It's simply the way our family survives. Her husband, Martin, nodded approvingly. Tradition has protected this company for 3 generations. We can't start bending rules now. I traced a fingertip along the rim of my glass, letting the sound hum low and steady, the only reply they'd get from me for now. To tradition, Martin declared. The room obeyed in unison. Crystal clinked. Smiles returned like masks repositioned after a scene. Across the table, Clara, their daughter, leaned forward, eyes bright with the certainty of inheritance. I mean, it's common sense, she said. The company should stay in the hands of real family. That's what makes us different. Different. I almost smiled. I lifted my glass, the bubbles rising like the smallest rebellions. To family, I said softly. The words tasted bitter, not because of what they meant, but because of what they didn't. Eleanor's gaze met mine, and for the briefest moment, her expression faltered. There it was, the flicker of recognition. She could sense it, even if she didn't understand it yet. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant. A candle guttered beside the centerpiece, its flame bending low before recovering, a small defiance in a room that mistook cruelty for civility. I set my glass down, the stem steady in my hand. You're right, I said quietly. Tradition matters. Eleanor's smile returned, pleased, triumphant, unaware. She didn't realize she'd just given me permission to end hers. They believed they were protecting their legacy. What they didn't know was that I already owned it. The road stretched ahead in silence, long, straight, indifferent. The kind of silence that followed laughter that wasn't real. City lights blurred through the windshield, dissolving into streaks of gold and red. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, even as my mind replayed every word Eleanor had spoken, every polite cruelty dressed as family tradition. Blood builds legacies. Her voice still echoed, soft and venomous. I turned off the radio. I didn't want anyone else's words filling the quiet. Tonight belonged to mine. Outside, the desert air pressed against the windows. Phoenix at night had a way of pretending it was peaceful, all those empty highways and distant mountains pretending to guard something sacred. But peace wasn't what I felt. Not anger, either. Something colder. Sharper. I stopped at a red light, the reflection of it painting my face in crimson. A family in a black SUV laughed in the lane beside me, a mother turning to hand fries to a child in the back seat. For a moment, I envied how ordinary their world looked. Then the light changed, and the feeling passed. I had grown used to being the one who never quite fit, the extra chair at the table, the smile too polite, the story always interrupted halfway through. They called it family. I called it performance. I'd spent years perfecting silence, learning how to breathe through slights, how to make myself smaller so they could feel larger. But tonight felt different. Something in me had stopped shrinking. When I reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. The dark felt honest. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound that didn't ask for anything. My phone buzzed. A group message from Eleanor's daughter, Clara, lovely dinner. So good to see everyone, red heart. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then deleted the message without replying. The night smelled faintly of rain, the kind that never really fell, only threatened to. I opened the window and let the cool air in. I thought of my grandmother then, her hands always steady, her voice calm even when life wasn't. People show their true nature when they think you have nothing they need, she used to say. I hadn't understood it fully until now. On the counter sat a single unopened envelope, cream paper, handwritten address, the kind that carried more truth than 1,000 conversations. I'd received it 5 years ago and read it only once. Tonight, I reached for it again. The wax seal cracked under my thumb. Her words waited patiently inside, as if she'd always known this night would come. And as I began to read, the sound of the city faded until all that remained was her voice, gentle, wise, and about to remind me who I really was. Because what she'd left me wasn't just money. It was power. And they still didn't know it. The paper had yellowed slightly along the edges, a soft sign of time's passing. Her handwriting, deliberate, elegant, looked the same as I remembered it from grocery lists and birthday cards. But this wasn't a note. This was something else. My dear Lila. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But I hope you've learned by now that loss isn't the end of love, only its quiet transformation. You've always been stronger than you think, and one day, that strength will be tested by people who mistake kindness for weakness. I paused, tracing the curve of her signature with my finger. It had been 5 years, but her words still carried weight, as if she'd written them knowing exactly where I'd be sitting tonight, alone, in the dark, finally ready to stop being quiet. I've left you my estate, not as charity, but as a tool. You see things clearly, even when others try to make you doubt yourself. Use this gift wisely. Build something of your own, not just to prove them wrong, but to remind yourself that your worth was never theirs to measure. I folded the letter carefully, feeling the faint texture of the ink through the paper. I remembered the day she'd given me my first journal, telling me, write things down before the world convinces you they didn't happen. She had seen it before anyone else, the glances, the whispered corrections, the constant reminders that I wasn't truly one of them. She had seen the isolation long before I'd found the words for it. When she passed, everyone expected her wealth to be distributed among the family. They had smiled through the funeral, already doing quiet arithmetic in their heads. And when the will was read, when my name was the only one mentioned, the silence in that room had been deafening. They'd called it a mistake. They'd called it unfair. Eleanor, especially, had called it unnatural. But my grandmother's attorney had simply said, her wishes are final. In the months that followed, I had done nothing flashy, no cars, no mansions, no show of triumph. I moved to a smaller apartment, took a quieter job, and disappeared into the background. They thought I'd wasted the inheritance. They thought I was small enough to forget. But I had other plans. Quiet ones. Patient ones. Because while they fought over what they believed they'd lost, I had started learning what I'd truly gained. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. I placed the letter back into its envelope and slid it into the drawer beside my desk, the one that held the documents only I knew about. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky, the kind that doesn't threaten yet, only warns. I stood by the window, watching the faint shimmer of lightning far out in the desert. Somewhere in that distance, the storm was moving closer. And for the first time in years, I felt it moving with me. They believed I'd vanished from their world. What they didn't realize was that I'd been building my own, one quiet move at a time. Morning came slow, the kind of pale gray light that made everything look like it hadn't quite decided to exist yet. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee untouched, the letter lying beside it like a conversation waiting for an answer. The city was waking up, cars humming in the distance, neighbors clinking dishes through thin apartment walls. Ordinary sounds, ordinary lives. I'd lived among them long enough to almost believe I was one of them. But last night had changed something. Eleanor's voice still hovered in my mind, that effortless cruelty disguised as family pride. I could have ignored it, the way I had 100 times before. But something in me refused this time. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the realization that silence had protected them far more than it had ever protected me. I opened my laptop and typed in a name I hadn't used in years, Whitmore and Hale Investments. The firm had been handling my finances quietly since the inheritance. My grandmother's lawyer had introduced me to a man named Daniel Whitmore, who specialized in discretion. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but I knew he'd pick up when I called. People like Daniel always did when money was involved. When his voice answered, smooth, steady, too polite for this early, it felt like pressing a hidden switch. "Lila," he said. "It's been a while." "It has," I replied. "I need to make some adjustments." There was a pause on the line. "To which account?" "All of them," I said. He hesitated, the sound of paper shuffling faintly through the receiver. "That's quite a statement. Should I assume this is about them?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city through the window. "I want you to compile everything we've done with Hawthorne Industries, every holding, every trust, every subsidiary." He exhaled quietly. "Of course. And what would you like to do with that information?" I let the silence stretch, feeling the decision settle into me, not like an impulse, but like something inevitable. "I want to know exactly how much of them I already own." For years, Hawthorne Industries, their family company, had been limping through bad management and inflated pride. I'd known this, of course. I'd seen the quarterly reports they bragged about on social media, each one polished to hide the cracks. But I also knew something they didn't. 5 years ago, when the company had been desperate for outside capital, an anonymous investor had saved them. That investor had been me. Daniel's voice returned. "Still anonymous, I assume." "For now," I said. "But not for long." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He just said, "You know this will create consequences." I smiled faintly, eyes still on the skyline. "Daniel, consequences only matter to people who didn't plan for them." He laughed once, softly. "Then I'll prepare everything. You'll have the full report by morning." When the call ended, the room felt different, lighter, maybe, or sharper. The kind of stillness right before a match is struck. I picked up my coffee, finally took a sip. It was cold, but I didn't mind. Some things were meant to cool before they burned. I glanced toward the drawer holding my grandmother's letter and whispered, almost to her memory, "You told me to build something of my own. I think I finally will." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow and deliberate. It felt like the world was giving permission. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were about to learn it was strategy. The report arrived the next morning, just as the first light touched the blinds. Daniel was punctual, always had been. A thick envelope waited at my door, sealed in his usual precise way. No courier label, no company logo. Discretion had its own elegance. Inside, the documents were divided by crisp separators, each labeled in his narrow handwriting. Hawthorne Industries, holding summary. I spread them across the table, paper whispering like a deck of cards being dealt by fate. Line by line, it unfolded: trusts, subsidiaries, shell entities tucked beneath neutral names. And beneath them, my initials. 5 years of quiet investment, every move calculated through patience and anonymity. What had started as a single bailout to keep their company afloat had grown, compounded, expanded, diversified, until now, the final page read the number I'd almost forgotten to want: 51%. Majority control. The kind of ownership that didn't just save a business, it defined it. For a long while, I just looked at the number, letting it sink into me. Not as triumph, but as truth. They had toasted family legacy. And all along, their legacy had been mine to decide. My phone buzzed. Daniel again. "Received everything?" he asked. I did. "You're the majority shareholder, Lila. By a fair margin. I don't think even they realize it yet." "I know," I said quietly. They never paid attention to details that didn't flatter them. He hesitated. "So, what now?" "Now," I said, "we begin the exit." He exhaled through the line. "That will cause shockwaves. if you pull that much capital at once. I'm aware. I just want to be clear, you understand what this means for them? Yes, I said. That's why I'm doing it. Outside, the morning had sharpened into gold. A neighbor's sprinklers hissed across dry grass, and for a moment I thought about how ordinary everything looked, how calm the world could appear seconds before it cracked. They built their pride on exclusion, I said finally. Let's see how it survives without foundation. Daniel was silent. Then, I'll prepare the withdrawal forms. It'll take 30 to 60 days for liquidation through the trusts. Make it 30, I said. And when the notification goes out, I want them to see exactly who it's coming from. He understood. He always did. After I hung up, I gathered the papers into a neat stack and set them aside. There was no satisfaction yet. Just inevitability. The truth had been waiting quietly all this time, like a fuse no one noticed until it burned too close to the edge. They'd spent years dismissing me as an outsider. By the time they discovered who I really was, there wouldn't be a company left to protect them. By Monday, the paperwork was ready. Neat, clinical, irreversible. Daniel had sent over the final documents for review, each page precise, almost surgical. I read through them slowly, my coffee growing cold again, tracing my name at the bottom of every form like signing a quiet goodbye. The words were ordinary enough: transfer, liquidation, reallocation, but between the lines, they meant something heavier: an ending. I called Daniel just before noon. Proceed, I said. His voice was steady, but lower than usual. Once we start this, there's no going back, Lila. When Hawthorne's finance division sees the withdrawal request, it'll trigger an internal alert. Within hours, the board will know their largest investor is leaving. I know, I said. That's the point. He hesitated. You don't sound angry. I'm not. I turned toward the window, sunlight cutting across my face. Anger is temporary. This is permanent. A pause. Then, understood. We'll begin the process this afternoon. The call ended. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock, small domestic sounds that felt strangely louder today. It was a strange feeling, dismantling something you'd once saved. But I didn't feel regret. Only clarity. They had built their comfort on my silence. Every lie, every toast, every word about family legacy had been financed by the outsider they dismissed. And now, that silence had teeth. I sat back down and looked over the letter one more time. My grandmother had written, "Strength isn't loud, Lila. It's quiet enough to make them think you've forgiven them." She'd been right. At exactly 2 p.m., Daniel sent the confirmation email. Subject line: execution completed. 3 words. That was all it took to tilt a family empire. By evening, my phone began to vibrate, calls, messages, all from numbers I recognized. Eleanor. Martin. Clara. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I poured a glass of water and stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched below, indifferent, alive. Somewhere in those offices downtown, panic was blooming. I imagined them reading the notice, the board members scrambling to understand the sudden void in their accounts, the whispers rising: who is Morrison Trust? Why are they pulling out? The pieces were moving exactly as planned. The irony was almost poetic: the company they guarded so fiercely, the legacy they used to wound me, was now hollow without my invisible hand keeping it upright. The night breeze was cool against my skin. I felt no guilt, no triumph. Just a steady, grounded peace. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it just stopped showing up. I finished my drink and glanced at the city lights below, watching the glow flicker against the glass. Somewhere out there, they were realizing how fragile their family empire truly was. By the time they found out who I was, the damage would already be done. And for once, I wouldn't be the one left in silence. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 9. They didn't know I knew. But of course, I did. I still held the majority rights, even as my exit papers quietly tightened around them. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habits. Precision had always been my armor. The building's lobby was all marble and pretense, tall glass walls, gold lettering that spelled out Hawthorne Industries, as if grandeur could hide decay. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. "Good morning, Ms. Hale. Are you here to see someone?" "Yes," I said, calm. "I'm here for the board meeting." A flicker of confusion passed over her face. She glanced at the digital register, at the list of names far above my own. "Ah, the board meeting is private," she said, polite but uncertain. "Executives and shareholders," I finished. "And I believe that includes me." She frowned, hesitating, and before she could speak again, the elevator chimed. Eleanor's voice followed before her body did. "Who's holding up the—" She stopped when she saw me. Even in panic, she managed to look composed, tailored navy suit, pearls sharp as teeth. But her eyes betrayed her. "Lila," she said slowly. "This isn't, you shouldn't be here." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I think I should." Behind her, Martin and Clara emerged from the elevator, faces drawn tight. The exhaustion was visible, nights spent calling investors who wouldn't return calls, scrambling to make sense of a sudden financial hemorrhage they didn't understand. "Where's the Morrison representative?" Martin demanded of the receptionist. "We need to speak to them immediately." I turned my head slightly. "You just did." For a second, the only sound was the soft hum of the lobby's air conditioning. Then Clara's laugh, brittle, incredulous. "You're joking." I handed Eleanor the letter, embossed, sealed, formal. She tore it open, her hands trembling more than she wanted them to. The color drained from her face as she read. "Morrison Holdings," she murmured. "A fully owned subsidiary of Hale Trust," her voice faltered. "Controlled by—" She stopped. Her eyes rose to mine, wide, disbelieving. "You?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Me." Martin stepped forward, voice cracking. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money." "I did," I said. "And I used it wisely." For a moment, no one spoke. The reality was too large, too sudden. Clara's eyes darted across the letter, as if reading faster could make the words rearrange themselves. This can't be legal," Eleanor stammered. You deceived us." "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "I saved you. You just never cared enough to ask who was doing the saving." The elevator behind them opened again. Daniel stepped out, immaculate as ever, portfolio in hand. He gave me a brief nod before addressing the group. "Everything is perfectly legal," he said. "Miss Hale has held controlling interest in Hawthorne Industries for 5 years." Eleanor looked as if she'd been struck. 5 years? "Yes," I said. 5 years of your speeches about bloodlines and family legacy, paid for by someone you called an outsider." The silence that followed was heavy, not angry, not loud. Just realization, sharp and exact. Clara whispered, "You own us?" I didn't smile. "No," I said. "I never wanted to own you. I just stopped letting you own me." I gathered the papers Daniel handed me, each one a formality confirming what was already true. Eleanor sank into a chair, her posture breaking for the first time I could remember. They had always mistaken composure for submission. Now they were learning what real control looked like. And I hadn't even begun to take it away yet. The days that followed unfolded like the slow-motion collapse of a skyscraper, each floor giving way in perfect sequence. By Thursday, the news had spread. Their lenders froze lines of credit, suppliers demanded guarantees, and rumors began seeping through the industry like smoke under a closed door. Hawthorne Industries, the dynasty built on pride and inheritance, was bleeding out. I didn't have to lift a finger. The math did it for me. From my apartment, I watched the unraveling in real time, headlines flashing across financial bulletins, stock graphs dipping like heart monitors. My phone buzzed constantly with calls I never answered. Eleanor. Martin. Clara. Even their lawyer, desperate for some kind of negotiation. Daniel sent updates each morning, transfer confirmations, liquidation progress, projected timelines. His emails were brief and clinical, the language of endings. By the end of the week, I owned nothing of Hawthorne Industries. And they, for the first time in their lives, owned everything they had earned, the wreckage. I thought I'd feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt stillness. A deep, almost reverent quiet. Revenge wasn't supposed to roar. It was supposed to end exactly like this, soft, complete, irreversible. On Friday afternoon, Daniel called. They've filed for emergency restructuring, he said. But it won't help. Without your capital, their assets can't cover liabilities. It's just a matter of days now. Let it happen, I said. He hesitated. You've done what most people only fantasize about, Lila. Don't you want to see it firsthand? The boardroom? The final meeting? I looked out across the skyline, sun setting behind glass towers, the city glowing like a distant memory. No, I said. I don't need to see the fall to know gravity works. That night, the rain returned, steady, cold, unrelenting. I left the window open and let it fill the silence. The sound reminded me of my grandmother's words, people learn best when the lesson costs them something they thought they'd never lose. By morning, I received a message from Clara. The text was short, frantic. Please. Talk to us. We'll fix this. Just tell us what you want. I read it twice, then deleted it. What I wanted had already happened. The truth had finally stripped them bare. Their name no longer meant safety. Their wealth no longer meant superiority. That afternoon, a news alert popped up on my phone. Hawthorne Industries declares bankruptcy after losing major investor. I watched the headline fade into the feed, swallowed by the next story. Empires fall quietly, I thought. The world rarely pauses to mourn the proud. Somewhere in their glass offices, Eleanor was realizing that legacy couldn't be inherited, only earned. And I, for the first time in my life, didn't feel like an outsider. I felt free. They had built their empire on arrogance and exclusion. And in the end, it collapsed under the weight of both. 2 weeks after the bankruptcy filing, the story had already turned into folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in business circles over expensive lunches. The family that lost everything to the woman they underestimated. Reporters called it poetic. I called it predictable. Headlines bled across the Phoenix Business Journal and half a dozen trade magazines. Hawthorne legacy crumbles after anonymous investor withdraws support. Family empire toppled by silence. Each article carried the same photograph, Eleanor and Martin outside the courthouse, their smiles gone, their posture suddenly human. Pride stripped to bone. I sat in a cafe downtown reading one of the pieces, the kind written by someone who'd never known humiliation firsthand. They used words like irony and fate, but they missed the truth entirely. This hadn't been revenge. It had been reclamation. Daniel joined me a few minutes later, setting his phone face down on the table. They've lost the estate, he said. The creditors seized everything, house, cars, the vacation property in Sedona. Even the art collection. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the milk curl into soft spirals. And the employees? Most of them were absorbed by other firms. Westmont Industries picked up the best of their engineers. No one's out on the street. I nodded. That mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. Innocent people didn't deserve to pay for someone else's arrogance. Daniel leaned back, studying me. You could have destroyed them completely, he said. Gone public. Taken the spotlight. Why didn't you? Because I don't need the world to know, I said quietly. They do. That's enough. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that understood restraint. You sound just like her. My grandmother? He nodded. She once told me in a meeting, strength isn't about winning. It's about knowing when you already have. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The cafe was warm, filled with the muted chatter of people who didn't know their lives could change with one decision. I envied their simplicity. When Daniel left, I stayed behind and opened my notebook, the same one I'd kept since the beginning. The first page held her handwriting, "Be patient, Lila. The world always circles back to truth." It had. And in that circle, they'd finally seen themselves clearly, stripped of titles, legacy, and illusion. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the skyline, I took a walk past their old headquarters. The glass facade reflected nothing but the fading light. The company name had already been peeled from the sign, leaving faint ghost letters behind, the remnants of importance. I stood there for a moment, not to gloat, but to understand what endings really looked like. They weren't loud. They were empty. My phone buzzed, another message from Eleanor. You've proven your point. Are you happy now? I deleted it without opening the rest. Happiness wasn't the goal. Peace was. And for the first time in years, I had it. They had spent decades defining me by absence, the one who didn't belong, didn't matter, didn't deserve. Now, their silence was my final inheritance. And they still hadn't realized it was worth more than everything they'd lost. 6 months later, the city no longer remembered their name. New companies filled the skyline, new headlines replaced the old ones. Time had done what it always does, moved on without asking permission. I'd moved too. Denver now, colder mornings, clearer skies. My apartment overlooked the mountains instead of desert, and when the wind swept through the valley, it carried a kind of honesty Phoenix never had. Every morning, I drove to the headquarters of Westmont Industries, the firm that had absorbed most of Hawthorne's former employees. They treated me not as a mystery investor, but as what I had always been, capable. A partner. A voice worth listening to. The first time I entered their boardroom, James Corwin, the CEO, greeted me with a handshake that felt sincere rather than strategic. Welcome home, he said. Simple words. Real ones. In meetings, no one mentioned family. They spoke about results, innovation, respect. It was a language I'd waited my whole life to hear. At night, my apartment was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. Quiet had changed its meaning, it no longer meant being silenced. It meant peace. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the glass, not the woman who'd once flinched under Eleanor's words, but someone steadier. Whole. On my desk sat the letter, still folded neatly, its edges soft with time. I'd stopped reading it every night, but I still kept it close. It had become less of a reminder and more of a promise kept. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, I received another message from Clara. The subject lines simply read, "Forgive us." No body text. No explanation. Just those 2 words, hanging there like a ghost of a life that no longer belonged to me. I didn't reply. Forgiveness wasn't something I needed to give, not out of cruelty, but because I had already outgrown the need for it. I went to the window and watched the city lights flicker against the white. Somewhere below, laughter drifted from a passing car. It felt good to hear it and not feel the ache of being on the outside. I thought of my grandmother, of her quiet certainty, her endless patience. Real strength doesn't fight to be seen, she'd said once. It just becomes impossible to ignore. Now, standing there with the cold pressing against the glass, I finally understood. They had taken my silence for surrender. They'd mistaken kindness for absence. But silence, when chosen, isn't weakness. It's power refined. I closed the letter, tucked it into the drawer, and turned off the light. The city below glowed faintly through the snow, alive, unbothered, forward-moving. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back. Because sometimes the most complete revenge is peace.